Well, I want to welcome to our series Dr. Josh Moody, pastor of College Church in Wheaton. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Christian. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to it. I'm always glad to have the opportunity to talk about biblical, gospel issues, and through the lens of Jonathan Edwards is a extra good thing. I'm looking up on your shelf. You've got a whole set of Yale Edwards volumes there, which is very impressive.
Yeah, well, not enough. I'm missing 10 volumes. And it always seems like the volume I need next is one of the ones I don't have.
Yeah, they're very good, aren't they? But they're not cheap.
They are. They are. Well, before we get into Edwards, I was reading a little bit about your bio. You have a pretty interesting life story. Would you mind sharing a bit of that with us? Where you grew up and how you got at College Church in Wheaton?
Yeah. Well, as you can tell from my accent, I was born in Texas. Yeah, I'm from London, basically, just the suburbs of London. And I grew up there and went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, did my PhD at Cambridge. In between the undergraduate and the PhD, I did some mission work in the former Soviet Union, because when the Berlin Wall had just fallen down and a number of us saw opportunities for pioneer evangelism. So I was in the Republic of Georgia right after the end of the Civil War there. And I did some missionary work there among university students. And then I was also traveling in Azerbaijan, which is a neighboring Muslim country, and did some missionary work there as well. And then my PhD was in theology, historical theology, and the thesis was on Jonathan Edwards. And as you know, Edwards's manuscripts, most of them, not all of them, but the vast majority are kept at Yale, at the Beinecke Library. And so I came out to Yale a number of different times, did a research fellowship, which is just an excuse to hang out at Yale and read a bunch of books. But I did that and got to know some people there. And then I was beginning to run a college ministry at the church I was attending. They brought me on staff to run their college student ministry. And on my team, I had a number of Americans who were doing PhDs at Cambridge. I was just completing or just had completed. So I had friends in common at America and friends at Yale. And there was a group of Yale PhD students who were trying to put together a Bible teaching church next to Yale University, which is not exactly the Bible Belt. And they contacted me. Cut a long story short, Rochelle and I took it as a very clear call of God. And we came out with a laptop, a printer, 3 suitcases, nowhere to stay, to a church of literally 20 people in a rented building.
Wow. Thinking,
well, you know, they want a little bit of help to get going. We'll do this for a couple of years. You know, I was 29. Why not? Give it a go. The church took off, went well. And then we thought we'd be there forever. And then after I'd been there 9.5 years or so, College Church, out of the blue, approached me. I wasn't putting out my resume or anything like that. They just came and said, would you be interested in having a conversation? And again, there's a long story behind that, but it was a very clear call of God, we believe. And I've now been here for 12 years.
Well, I'd say, well, at this point, I guess you can say that you heard correctly from God.
Well, I never like to say thus says the Lord unless I'm reading the Bible, but I do believe it was his leading. Yeah.
I understand. So what about Jonathan Edwards drew you, like, in particular?
Yeah, so I was studying history as an undergraduate, and in particular I was emphasizing history of ideas, and in particular I was ending up looking at the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and the birth of secularization. So in essence, I was reading a whole bunch of atheists or crypto-atheists, and as I was reading I was a Christian. As I was reading their arguments, I found them quite frustrating because I didn't find them particularly persuasive. And I wanted to counter those arguments. I was writing papers on these guys, and I wanted to say, Rousseau says this, but really, that's not a good argument because of X, Y, and Z. But as a historian, you can't do that. You have to just, there's a way of doing that, but you can't just insert your opinion. You have to describe the historical argument. So I was thinking about this and praying about this, and I was walking down the stacks at the University Library of Cambridge. The University Library of Cambridge is huge. It's also very ugly. It's one of those ugly buildings. I mean, Cambridge is beautiful, but the University Library is not. It's incredibly ugly. But it's an amazing building. It's massive, and it's a holding library. So it's meant to have access to every book that is published in Britain. So it's a huge place, and you can get on in the stacks, unlike the Bodleian in Oxford, where they don't allow you into the stacks. You can the UL, the University Library of Cambridge. So anyway, I'm walking down these at random. I turned down the one of the corridors at random. I turned down a line of the shelves at random, and I pick out a book at random, and I open it up. And I open it to what I now know is a very famous drawing of a spider that looks like it's like floating through the air. It's Edwards's famous spider drawing. And I look at that and go, I check the date. I think this is very early sort of Newtonian science-like. And so then I put it back on the shelf, and I pick out another volume, and I start reading it. I go, this is a Puritan sermon. Who is this guy? I'd never heard of him. He isn't read in high school in England at all. And so I started to read him. And that was the genesis of my work on Edwards, is looking at his response to the Enlightenment.
Well, I appreciate your honesty in that. I have not yet confessed to my doctoral advisor how many of the seminal texts I quoted in my dissertation that I found by random, just pulling books off the shelf, books I should have known about. So I'll just pretend that,
Providence.
Yeah, I always knew that those were there. I appreciate that. Well, so you did Edwards and the Enlightenment for your doctoral thesis, and you published it as Jonathan Edwards and the Enlightenment, Knowing the Presence of God. Could you just kind of summarize in that book what you were arguing for, or maybe arguing against?
Yes, I was arguing that Edward was formulating that the first Edward read the Enlightenment authors, some of them firsthand, some of them secondhand. So that the first point of the argument was that he was actively engaged in the wider Enlightenment conversation. And there's evidence for this by his Locke, of course, famously, he talks about reading, but he also had access to the journals that describe their thinking. And he was very engaged in the wider conversation about what was going on through letter writing and things like this. So that was the first point of the argument. He knew about it. He was engaged in it. The second point was that he was formulating an active response to the Enlightenment. So he didn't just know about it. He was actually trying to counter it. And in terms of his atheistic tendencies, he was very much a man of reason and light in that sense. But in terms of its secularization, to use the word in a non-Christian sense, he was trying to counteract it. And you can see that in his philosophical notebooks. But the argument I was making was, in addition to him counteracting his philosophical notebooks, the unpublished notebooks, and some people historically said, well, he didn't publish them, so who knows whether he really thought that. So the other part of the argument was say, well, they're in his notebooks, but in his writings published and in his sermons, you can, while he doesn't use all the same jargon and philosophical technicalities he does in his notebooks, in the sermons at a practical, pastoral, and evangelistic level, he's using those ideas that he's discerned, that he's discovered at the coalface of his thinking, and then translating them as a contextualizing the gospel for his age in a way so that the message of the gospel lands for the people he's trying to reach. And there are a number of like key ideas he uses there. So light is clearly one of them. So while historically the description of the 18th century as the age of enlightenment is a historiographical description, not a contemporaneous description, they did though think of themselves as an age of light. So they knew something was going on. So it's a bit like our day today, where we know we're in the midst of some kind of technological revolution, but we don't self-identify as the age of technology or something. No one talks it like that. We just know something's happening. And similarly, then they knew something was happening. And so this light was one of the key tropes for as a sort of trigger for all that discourse. And of course, it has biblical imagery too. And you find in Edwards' sermons, he uses that imagery to connect this wider sensibility in the culture with the gospel truth. Most famously, his sermon about a divine and supernatural light being both a biblical, scriptural, and rational doctrine. And I made the case that use of the word light, obviously it's a biblical use of the word light, but it's chosen because it connects that conversation that he's having in his study and with thinking through all the wider issues. And then, you ask someone about their thesis and they go on forever, so I'll stop in a moment. And then I argued that right at the heart of it for Edwards was a epistemological issue. So he was saying that, and this connects to different parts of the sort of thought universe, but he was saying that that what we now think of as like the Newtonian worldview, or the Newtonian way of looking at science, which is a sort of closed box, mechanistic way of looking at the world that we no longer think is entirely accurate and is supplemented by quantum mechanics and obviously Einsteinian ways of looking at things. But that in their time, it's like this closed box way of looking at the universe, the machine. He pushes back about that and develops a way of looking at the universe that is much more fluid. I called it perceptivist, that God is the divine perceiver. And so he says at one point in one of his notebooks, he says, strictly speaking, the only substance, using that word substance in Aristotelian sense, technical sense, the only substance is God. What he's saying then is this materialistic world isn't really substance. And because of that, then epistemologically, we can connect with God, we can know God. It's not like he's somewhere out there and he's got the ball rolling in a sort of deistic way, which is where a lot of thinkers went towards deism. No, God is directly involved. And so anyway, the thesis is saying he's interacting with Enlightenment, he's formulating a response at a technical level, but then at a popular level that leads to a lot of the terminology that's used in the revivals of the Great Awakening.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I guess I wonder, I think a lot of people wonder, this may be an unanswerable question, or at least in this format, is where is Edwards getting this stuff? I mean, Newton he had access to through the Dummer collection. Locke he had access to through the Dummer collection. He may have had access to some of these ideas third hand through some people, but like, what are some other sources that Edwards may have been reading or discussing to kind of move him in that Enlightenment direction?
Well, the most, and you mentioned some of them, but the most famous, of course, is Locke, where he talks about how he read Locke, and Locke is right at the heart of, in some ways, Locke is more influential in the American way of thinking than the English. It's strange, I mean, he's so influential on the whole Enlightenment and the revolution and formative influence. And Edwards talks about, with the great delight he read Locke. So that would be the most obvious. You've mentioned some of the his journal interaction, his list of books. He also is involved in some of the uh, some of the heterodox Christian deistic thinkers that he mentions by name that he disagrees with. So I don't think we can paint Edwards as like sitting down with Rousseau in a coffee house in Paris. He's not engaged in that sense. But because we're so used to the immediacy of modern communication, it's hard for us to get a sense of the extent to which people were connected across Western civilization through books, through conversation, through letters. Obviously, the speed of communication was slower, but it was very much there. And you can trace that. And so anyway, that's the case I make.
Oh, I appreciate that. I think one of the issues I try to unravel in my video is it seems like there are two streams of thought that Edwards is bringing together somehow: the scholastic stream of thought, the Turretin, the von Maastricht, the education that he may have gotten in Wethersfield from former Harvard tutors like his cousin Williams, Elisha Williams. And then there's this new stream of thought, this Enlightenment stream of thought. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on, was Edwards, by embracing this Enlightenment discourse, was Edwards rejecting scholastic thought? Was he trying to harmonize it? Is it a little bit more complicated where he was holding on to some things, getting rid of others? How would you describe the relationship between Edwards' scholastic fountain and his Enlightenment fountain?
Yeah, I suppose it depends what you mean by scholastic. I've always found that term flexible. So, but I think that Edwards' primary theological influence, and maybe it's because I'm English, I think this way, but and I've read a lot of British Puritans, but it seems pretty clear to me that Adrian Neely, of course, cites his influence from the sort of Dutch Reformed Calvinistic route too. Adrian's a good friend, a very, very good scholar. So I'm sure he's right. But I just don't know that world so well. But to me, when I read Edwards, having read at the same time and beforehand a lot of Owen, a lot of Sibbes, it seems pretty obvious he's using similar language. And I think I would say that's his primary theological influence. Now, having said that, Edwards was an original thinker. Not many people are, actually, but he was. And so famously, he said, for the sake of definition, I'm a Calvinist. Meaning, like, if you want to put me in a box, that's the box you can put me in if you want to. But he obviously didn't really think of himself as following a tradition. Contemporary descriptions of him by his friends and mentors are of someone whose nose was always in the Bible and clearly trying to get his ideas rather than primarily from any sort of theological tradition. For the sake of definition, I'm a Calvinist. So, okay, so that's where I come from. But he was constantly wrestling with Scripture, and I think that's one of his gifts to the contemporary church is that ability to say, yeah, I do have a theological background, tradition, you want to use that phrase, but I'm going to Scripture and I'm letting that shape my mind rather than my system shape my mind. And so Edwards came up with some things that probably neither you and I would agree with, but then he also came up with other things that were really, really helpful. I mean, I don't agree with his postmillennialism. I think he was mistaken there. And I don't thoroughly agree with his view of the universe that it was famously he said, when we look at creation, we see the same evidence of God as the creator as we would have done if we'd been there at the moment that he created everything. And I know what he's getting at, but that doesn't seem quite right to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah. In my research, I deal a lot with his
You're in
eschatology.
oh,
I
do you?
love,
Yeah.
yeah, I love Edwards. I don't like anything he writes about eschatology in general. So.
No, nor do I. Not well, perhaps not nothing, but mainly, I don't agree with him. And of
Yeah,
course, that eschatological tradition sort of died in the Civil War, which is interesting, because pre-Civil War, pretty much everyone was post-millennial, and after the Civil War, no one was. So there you go. I mean, it's amazing how we're influenced by our.
yeah. Although I will say that an article I'm working on now may be very distressing to some, including Doug Wilson. Because I do a lot with Edwards and warfare, one of my arguments is postmillennialism is, like you said before, a category that's imposed back on Edwards. Edwards doesn't completely fit it.
No, he doesn't fit anything completely,
Yeah,
does
and
he?
at least not in the way that Doug Wilson wants him to,
Yeah.
because Edwards did think that the world is going downhill until a war rescues it. But you know what? In each of the three millennial categories we've developed, they all have the same trajectory. It's a war of some sort, kind of seals the end. So,
Well,
yeah,
exactly. And yeah, and I'm not very chiliistic, to use the ancient category at all. I mean, because I'm an Anglican background, I don't tend to think in chiliistic terminology at all. It's just not how I think that the story of eschatology is much simpler than, well, this is, obviously a controversial area in American evangelicalism in general, American Christendom, but I tend to think that the Bible teaches that Jesus is coming back, and we don't know when. In the meantime, we better get on with preaching Jesus, and that's about where I leave it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, one of my goals for this week is I wanted to have an interview with both you and Adrian. And in true Dutch Reformed fashion, Adrian said he is booked through December 2022. So I will hold him to that.
Yeah,
Because I do think that this question
I'll
of
make sure you say hi. He's a great guy and a good
I
friend.
will. I know him just a little bit, but every interaction I've had with him has been wonderful, and I hope to have more in the future. Um, let's see. Now, we talk about how Edwards' Enlightenment education may have kind of driven Edwards in some cool and creative ways. Is there any ways in which you think the Enlightenment might have actually hurt Edwards' theology?
Well, that's been a long, Bevington and all that conversation about the influence of Enlightenment on evangelicalism. And it always depends what you mean by the Enlightenment. I mean, some parts of the Enlightenment were very good, of course, from a Christian point of view. I mean, science is a good thing, and science, but when I'm talking about, when I'm using the term Enlightenment, I'm talking about more the reflection on science by the philosophers and the more radical English reflection that led to people like David Hume and stuff like that. So the arguments made by some is that contemporary evangelicalism is shaped by the Enlightenment in an unhealthy way, and that leads to sort of colonialistic, paternalistic, white, Western way of looking at the gospel. Yeah, I mean, I think that, the obvious critique of Edwards, and I don't know whether this connects to the Enlightenment or not, it may connect it, arguably could connect the authoritarian elements within colonialism. But the obvious critique of Edwards is his support of slavery. And I just have to say, I think he was wrong, and he is wrong about things. So I think you can tie yourself in knots by saying, well, it's not like he was vehemently pro-slavery. Of course not. He basically, his argument was, this is what it is. There's nothing we can do about it. We better make the best of it. That's really what he's saying. And of course, his successors, Jonathan Edwards Jr., his son, Samuel Hopkins, were all at the forefront of the abolition movement. So it's not like he was a racist slave trader or something, but I still think he was wrong. And now, is it possible to sort of connect Enlightenment rationalism to that sort of meta-narrative domination that the postmodernists would do and say, Edwards was impacted by that? I actually think primarily the answer to that would be no, because I think primarily what Edwards is doing is pushing back against the Enlightenment. So he's embracing the scientific things. That's why he died, of course, because he accepted vaccination. Get really controversial.
Yeah.
He had, when smallpox inoculation was extremely controversial at the time, he, just a good example, was vaccinated and died from a secondary infection.
Yeah.
He was a man of science in that sense. So he accepted some bits of it, but then he pushed back against all the elements that I think are nefarious, a lot of Christians do, that led to a kind of closed box, not just rational, but like domineering sort of approach. I think he pushed back against that. And, Edwards now is being recovered, but there was a long time when he was not really read because people just accepted the caricature of him as a hellfire preacher.
Yeah.
So I think I would say primarily, no, he was critiquing the Enlightenment rather than embracing it. And I think there are parts of the Enlightenment that need to be in an ongoing way critiqued from the gospel.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I am not a postmodernist, but I remember in undergrad when postmodernity was now becoming a thing to study. And I was always struck by the question, well, yeah, this I don't think is helpful, but I don't think modernism was,
right,
as much of our friend as we now think it is, now that we're facing postmodernism. Neither one is really what the Bible advocates for.
Yeah, I'm glad for empiricism. I'm glad for science. I'm glad for planes that fly and a medicine that by and large kind of works. That's all very good stuff.
Yep.
On the other hand, I'm not glad for the lack of meaning and beauty and significance that sort of closed box view of the universe can generate. And it's like you become the ghosts in the machine is, the ghosts are gone, the spirits are gone from the, and of course Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, that's why they created these magical worlds to try and put magic back into the universe.
Yeah.
And again, the answer to that is, well, Christmas and the gospel, the work of the Spirit and all that. But so there's pros and cons. I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're bumping up on something I love to talk about that we'll skip now, is the assumption of progress. And when things come, yeah, there's great things that I'm glad I live in a world with anesthesia. I'll give up a lot to have that, but it has other consequences as well. So
right.
Is it really progress? We'll save that for a personal discussion, but I know you've written broader than Edwards. Is there anything that you're working on right now?
Well, there's a book that's coming out in the spring that I'm not really working on because it's done, but that's my next thing. It's a book on holiness. I teach at Wheaton College as well now, and I shared with my students that I teach over there that I'm teaching on the book's coming out on holiness. And they were like, wow, how do you write, J.C. Ryle, book on holiness, what else is there to say? It's not really attempting to be a J.C. Ryle replacement. But I do think that the Christian movement of the West has, here I'm speaking as a person who spent his life preaching the Bible. So I believe thoroughly in emphasizing the centrality of the word, the importance of the word. But if we do that, we should have a call to Christ-likeness and character. And it seems to me the lesson of the last 10, 15 years in the part of the Christian church that's emphasized preaching the word is that we've underemphasized life and character. And so anyway, this book is called Everyday Holiness. It's a call and hopefully a series of practical instructions about how, sinners and broken people like you and I can make some progress in becoming a bit more like Jesus. Yeah. So that's out next. And I've got another idea for a book that I'm working on, but it's still too early to tell you exactly what it is.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, I am struck with how Edwards was captured by holiness when he went to New York City. It's his first entry in the miscellanies. He preaches the way of holiness. He talks about it in his personal narrative. And we'll actually discuss that in episode 5 of my series when we go down to New York. But I think holiness is one of these aspects of Edwards' thought that hasn't really been mined as much as it should, especially in his relationship to, like, what does it mean for soteriology? What does it mean for sanctification? How did it, connect with the revivals? So that'll be, I look forward to reading your book. I'm sure it's not an Edwards book, but book on holiness.
No, it's really on Colossians 3, basically.
Oh, outstanding. So if someone was watching this video and happened to be living in the greater Chicago area, how would they find out more about College Church and what you guys are doing there in Wheaton?
Yeah, well, as always these days, just go to the web. Type in College Church, Wheaton. We're just about 30 minutes out from downtown Chicago. And we'd love to have you with us. Yeah. There are a lot of good churches in Chicago, and we're trying to be a biblical church, but there are many others that we could recommend too. So if you're listening and looking for a church in Chicago and you're in our area, you'll be very welcome. But you may find there's another Bible teaching church closer to you, and go to that one then.
Outstanding. Well, I have a lot more questions for you that someday we'll be able to follow up on, both on Edwards and on ministry, because I'm a pastor that does writing, and I'm still trying to figure that out for myself, but we'll save those for another time. Josh, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.